On behalf of our panel, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional lands that we do our work on and recognise First Nations custodians for the care of country and its ecologies over millennia, as well as pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. We have a very esteemed panel here today who are going to take us across the humanities and creative arts to give us a sense of how creative practice benefits and supports individuals, communities, and therefore society. In a time of crisis and within a predicted future of extreme weather events, it's a pretty big task. However, artists and scholars who've been working and writing about these particular approaches appreciate that there needs to be careful consideration of approaches within such circumstances of crisis and predicted disaster. Our methodologies must be ethical. In my field, for example, in theatre, practitioners have been discussing how some approaches are more effective than others for decades, and some may be damaging. Hence, we need to address what constitutes best practice. And I would argue that the arts are not, creative arts are not inherently therapeutic. One of the more innovative approaches that's been developed within theatre recently is actually what we'd call rehearsal for disaster. This can range from practical reenactment of what to do, what might happen, what to do, and how to prepare. But it can also involve a kind of simulation for frontline workers, for the community to be prepared. So our panel today reflects diverse practices as it grapples with the ethics of working with individuals and communities in crisis. Now, when we were discussing what we could bring together as a panel, we came up with several intentions that seem to be behind the work. I wouldn't quite call them ethical principles yet, but working towards ethical principles. Firstly, that of listening, which is central to collaboration. Second, working processes that translate experience and felt responses into languages, including digital and visual languages. And thirdly, the intention of social inclusiveness. We'll come back to these. So that broadly describes how our diverse approaches come together. So I'm going to introduce our very esteemed panel now in the order that they will be speaking. And I'm only introducing them briefly, but please look at the programs for a more detailed description. And I'd like to say that they've each got 15 minutes and we'll come to questions at the end. So introducing Dr. Tamara Boravisha is a researcher, creative practitioner, exploring the intersections of health, embodiment and social justice. She is currently a Vice-Chancellor's postdoctoral fellow at RMIT University, and her work has been recognised with research awards, including RMIT's Research Excellence Award in 2024. Tamara draws on arts-based methodologies, and these include dance, visual art and storytelling to generate new insights into trauma, grief, resilience and under the umbrella of mental health, particularly among young people. Jill Bennett is a Scientia Professor and Australian Research Council Laureate Fellow at UNSW. She's the founding director of Big Anxiety Research Centre and the Felt Experience and Empathy Lab. She's also co-lead of the Ageing Futures Institute. So her research is predominantly in the area of trauma, psychosocial design and creative practice. And current projects with virtual reality include transforming trauma and working with 5 regional remote First Nations communities. Helena Graham is currently the Vice-Chancellor's Professional Research Fellow at Edith Cowan University. She's held leadership roles at Murdoch University, including Dean of Research. And her research deals with the intersections of art, technology, politics and spectatorship in a contemporary context. And Helena would be the best known person on ethics in my field. And which she's published widely on, and several of her publications have won prizes. Now, Pam Peters is Emeritus Professor at Macquarie University, where she's held a personal chair in linguistics. She's been director of the Macquarie University's Dictionary Research Centre and a member of the editorial committee over decades. She continues on the editorial boards of English Worldwide, English Today, and she served for decades on the ABC's Language Committee, controversial there perhaps, and contributed 6 chapters to the Australian Government Style Manual. Her current research interests include varieties of English in the Indo-Pacific and the readability of health messaging for the general public, along with creating online term banks, and most specifically in family law and building and construction. So you can see how diverse our panel is today, and please welcome our first speaker, Tamara.
Well, I got this honor to talk to you right after lunch and try to keep you awake with the cheerful topic of grief and mourning. So thank you for showing up and bearing with me. I'd like to start by acknowledging the country on which this work has been conducted, which is the land of Wurundjeri people of Bundwurrung and Woiwurrung language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nation. I'd like to acknowledge their elders, past, present, and emerging, and those that potentially could be with us in the room. I also like to note that as a fairly recent migrant to this country, I, like many others, continue to benefit from the colonial project, which hasn't been finished. The title of my presentation today is Grief, Mourning, and Creative Practice Approach, Reflections from the Morning After, which was exhibition and public program delivered at the RMIT's Design Hub Gallery earlier this year in Melbourne or Naarm. So the ethnographic research we conducted prior to conceiving and delivering the exhibition and the public program showed us that grief is indeed everywhere. It is both personal and collective, shaped by cultural, social, political, and ecological forces. The morning after, an exhibition and public program co-curated with my colleagues, distinguished Professor Larissa Hjort, here with us in the room, and Dr. Catherine Garber, investigated how interdisciplinary creative practice can function as a methodology for engaging with grief, mourning, and hope in the context of cultural and climate crisis. The exhibition and its public program deliberately opened conversations about grief literacy, inviting audiences to consider mourning not only as something private and isolating, but as a shared social and cultural practice that helps us make sense of change, loss, and continuity. So prior to conceiving the exhibition and public program, we conducted a wide ethnographic research with interviewing more than 100 people and collaborated with an advisory group made out of experts in the field, including Grief Australia, who really gave us a set of tools with how to approach this topic and bring it into the public spaces, including cultural spaces, which I don't think I need to tell you, we're not really prepared for this topic, and such a wide and rich response from our audiences. In shaping our approach to this work, we carefully considered several key concepts. One was, of course, the definition of grief, and in this work, we understand grief as a cognitive and emotional response to a significant loss, and as a historically, culturally, and socially mediated emotion. While everybody grieves differently, inequalities around the right to grieve and socially acceptable forms of grief, especially when it comes to non-death related losses, continue to persist. Feminist scholar Judith Butler work on what is grievable powerfully frames this unequal terrain. Some lives and losses are publicly mourned, others remain invisible. Grief is also unruly. It's uncomfortable, messy, cyclical, and prone to transform into other affects. Mourning requires time for remembering, witnessing, and reminiscence, practices that run counter to late capitalism's demand for constant movement and productivity. Contrasting clinical framings of normal grief, normal under quotation marks, and diagnostic categories such as prolonged grief disorder, as defined in ICD-11, Butler invites another mode of engagement, tarrying with grief. To tarry is to linger with the unbearable rather than rush to closure or instrumental meaning-making. Staying with grief, she argues, can cultivate ethical attention. It returns us to shared vulnerability, reveals who and what our communities count as grievable, and can open political insight into unequal distributions of harm and responsibility. In the context of the climate crisis, Australian environmental humanities scientist Blanche Verley asks us to learn how to bear worlds as a way of attending to human and more than human pain that renders the crisis meaningful and collective and opens imaginative shared forms of action. To address these tensions, the Morning After program explored collective, cultural, environmental, political, and anticipatory grief to creative practice and participatory workshop formats. We ground this project in feminist relational ethics of care and post-human theoretical approaches that attend to the entanglement of grief, mourning, hope, and creative resilience. A significant focus of this project and more recent focus of my work has been on ecological grief. Canadian scholars Ashley Consolo and Neville Ellis define ecological grief as the embodied bereavement for more than human losses, the grief over species, ecosystems, and landscapes eroded by acute or chronic environmental change. Eco-grief operates across scales and generations and can be physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually draining. It is essential to note that while the influence of human activity on climate change is well documented, this does not mean that the impact of climate crises are evenly distributed or evenly experienced, or that we, all of us, are equally responsible for pushing environmental systems to the edge. First Nations knowledges consistently foreground relational practices with more than human worlds, as we've seen and heard earlier this morning, and demonstrate long-standing modes of care. Eco-grief is, we recognized in our project, situated unevenly across places and cultures. This presentation argues for the arts and humanities as critical spaces for developing reparative, non-extractive frameworks and methods that center emotion, connection, and embodied knowledge in ethically grounded ways, methods capable of responding to collective ruptures with care, imagination, and relational depth. Drawing on Eve Kosowski-Sedgwick's concept of reparative reading, Moreno, Gabriel, and Johnson argue for arts-based research and intervention with disenfranchised group as a reparative process. They advocate for reparative methods that foreground affect, vulnerability, and creativity. These authors suggest that the reparative approach extends conventional methods by attending to feelings, senses, being, and belonging, ultimately aiming towards social transformation. Our creative practice workshops, conceived as a collective method, approach, and action research, included visual mapping of griefy affects as they emerge on social media in our everyday interactions, body mapping to trace grief's lingering embodied textures, visual exercises for mapping climate emotions, as well as rituals for honoring loss. Rather than treating grief as a problem to be fixed, these practices approached it as a dynamic, socially distributed process that unfolds across bodies, media, and public spaces. I'm going to play a little video of the exhibition to show you the context in which we work. In the video, you will see the brilliant curator of this project, Professor Larissa Hjort, sitting over there cringing right now, but you're not going to be hearing her words. So at the end of my slides, there is a link to a website where all of this material is hosted, and you can engage more deeply with the exhibition. Here, you're just stuck with me. Okay. Creative practice is both a mode of inquiry and a means of engagement. It navigates complexity, gives voice to lived experience, and imagines alternative futures. The Morning After public program ran 26 creative workshops delivered by 28 facilitators from 6 universities nationally. It attracted over 700 registrations with more than 350 participants, and the exhibition overall drew over 1,500 visitors. By perforating the boundaries of individual experience and opening space for shared making, storytelling, and meaning making, the workshops generated a rich dialogue across vulnerability, memory, possibility, and care. This presentation proposes participatory arts and creative practice as methods for relational, affective, and imaginative attunement, ways to grasp and respond to the scale of cultural and environmental crisis and grief it produces. I argue that creativity and art serve as essential mediums for visceral and empathetic understanding of the magnitude and implications of the current crisis, leading to eventual, sometimes speculative, sometimes hopeful future making. I will have to move us further, but please do go and visit the video documentation that showcases this work. One of the central tenets of our work was reimagining mourning from an individual, isolating perspective to a more social, cultural, and political one, and to suggest that mourning can be seen as a ritual and process that binds and connects us in powerful ways, and that can lead to a collective Venus across human and more than human relational ties. A few words about the workshops. The slides, on this slide and the forthcoming slides, you will see images from the 26 workshops we've conducted that are all showing participants without really showing participants. We had to be creative to de-identify people who participated in the public program in indicating the work. So, grief mapping workshop, facilitated with my colleague Larissa, reimagined mapping as a speculative visual arts practice for tracing the affective textures of grief across mobile media, such as eulogies, legacy making, and memorialization posts, broadening the registers of grief literacy. Beyond personal loss and bereavement, which was a frequent companion to the exhibition visitors, the workshops broadened the grief registers to include cultural grief, ecological grief, political grief, anticipatory grief, cumulative grief, and more. Workshop participants spoke of losing partners, children, parents, siblings, pets, health, relationships, dreams, futures, homelands, homes, and more, broadening how we understand what contemporary loss means. In making art about and from experiences of loss and mourning, the participants wove collective tapestries of grief and grew new vocabularies for mourning. Our facilitator induction guide included clear trauma-informed reminders, such as, do not tell visitors you will recover from grief, or the goal of grief is to move on, or if you aren't crying, then you aren't grieving, and similar phrases, just indicating how little grief literacy exists in the broader community, and including arts and culture institutions. Our public program framed creative methods explicitly as grief work and grief literacy work. The body mapping workshops, one that you see on the screen right now, attune to the grief via embodied close reading, how the body archives grief and how creative practices make such archives intelligible. We particularly paid attention to ecological loss and eco-grief as they live in the participants' embodied imaginaries. Beyond eco-anxiety and eco-grief, which tend to dominate the discussions around climate emotionality, the participants map their frustration, anger, and love for the natural world. One body map, the one you see on the screen right now, shows the ocean and forest living inside the participant with care, attachment, and grief interlaced. We worked with nature-based objects to help identify and name affective traces the eco-emotions produce and move across our bodies, including care and hope for the planet. This was intentional. The morning after invited participants beyond despair into engagement by interdependence, care, and justice. The exhibition's red thread and hopeful tagline. The images on the current slide are from a workshop where my colleague Fiona Hillary, a visual and public artist known for her work on post-human future imaginaries, took us on an imaginary walk through the world overtaken by Karinia, Mikimoto, and other algae, as this workshop happened during the recent algae bloom in South Australia. Walking and listening to this, at the time, not so impossible imaginative soundscape and ecoscape, participants considered what it might mean to live through the end of the Anthropocene and what it would mean to not have angry feelings towards algae that is simply responding to the positive environmental stimuli. And final few images show the copy healing workshop led by Muti Muti Yorta Yorta and Bunvurung Bamba Bamba artist Marie Clark with Nicholas Hovington. The participants under Marie's and Nicholas's careful guidance worked 7 kilos of clay each into a healing hat that was traditionally carried by a bereaved person to symbolize the weight of grief. If you have not placed 7 kilos of clay on your head, I can assure you that it changes how you see and experience your body and the world around you. The palpable weight of grief in this traditional healing practice and other traditional healing rituals is to be acknowledged and felt. To conclude, we draw on artist Marion Barr's words that the real work of grief is to make knowable, viscerally, emotionally, and affectively, the magnitude of loss so that a more hopeful future emerges through symbiotic collaboration and cooperation. The creative practice workshops I have described here, briefly though, because it is 15 minutes only, created a space for quiet, fleeting, or difficult emotionality to be expressed, witnessed, and potentially transformed, providing a means for individuals and communities to navigate the complexities of grief while simultaneously working towards a more just and sustainable future. The Morning After public program invited us to reframe our relationship with our bodies, the more than human world, one another, and the future, fostering a collective vision of a more hopeful and equitable world amid the present cultural and environmental crisis. Here are some of our references, and like I said, more information about the Morning After project can be found on its website, and if you wanted to stay in touch with us, you can do that via LinkedIn and Instagram. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. So, Learning from Lived Experience is the title of an event that we did actually with Tamara's team in Melbourne in 2022, and it deliberately echoes the title of a book by the psychoanalyst Wilfred Bion, who's been quite influential on our recent work. But the concept really summarises the work we've done with the big anxiety festivals and various engagement events, and also the experience visualisation program that I've developed throughout the course of my ARC Laureate Fellowship using immersive media, hence the VR headsets there. So just briefly, The Big Anxiety is a festival that was founded in 2017. We did 2 quite big iterations across Greater Sydney, and then COVID happened, and we, after COVID, we came to Melbourne, RMIT, in 2022. And then we also did some work in Brisbane using this big reach concept where we explored regional connections. So this festival, in essence, was an arts and mental health festival, but the focus has really been on working with communities in a very bottom-up way, so working from and with lived experience. And so this rubric has been the catalyst for developing a lot of methods of co-creation. This is one of the forums, Learning from Lived Experience forums we did in Brisbane, actually, and you see there we're using, one of the techniques we use is from the New York performance artist Lois Weaver, the long table, which is a facilitated, open-ended discussion, and we've done these in relation to trauma and suicide, and they've been quite impactful. But as you can imagine, there's quite a lot that goes into what we might call trauma-informed design and the sort of holding and designing the space. We founded the Big Anxiety Research Centre to be a hub for this kind of work when we started to move around Australia. And that's one of the events that we do yearly, or often more than yearly, just experimenting with the sort of spatial design aspects of festival delivery, and really focusing on, I suppose, the process of having an experience, which is central to our research methodology. So, rather than talking about experience. So this forum, it actually looks a lot more formal than it is in that image. That's a really nice kind of relaxed campfire piece that was developed by Uti Kulinjaku, who are a group of Ngangkari traditional healers from the APY lands. And they've been a key part of all of our festivals. And that's because they have a sort of innate understanding of the way that arts and health work and are, in fact, indivisible. So Uti Kulinjaku is a collective that the Ngangkari formed to do mental health work, and they were very proactive in developing creative tools. And they actually came to us about 8 years ago when we were developing VR tools and programs, and said that they had a use for this medium, which they had a brilliant understanding of, actually. And this piece on the left, you have to allow that this is virtual reality, kind of flattened out into 2 dimensions. But it's a traditional story about a man who gets stuck in a log. But the meaning of that story for the Ngangkari is quite profound and layered. So they talk about how the experience of being in the log is one of entrapment and alienation. And what happens in the story is, so you as the viewer, user of this VR piece are in the log, and so you experience this sort of confinement, and you can peer out through gaps in the log, and you see these beautiful 360 shots of country. So this is shot quite close to Uluru. And then you see these women there in the image are the community and family who come to look for the lost man. But then they describe how the feelings sort of fluctuate and actually intensify as you imagine your separation from community. You see the women, you can't be there for them, you can't connect with them, and so this kind of shame is internalised. And so it struck us from the start that Ananu culture and language really allows for this incredibly nuanced, embodied description of mental health. And so we're now working actually on a second piece with them on intergenerational trauma. And there you see what happens in the end. You're actually released and given sustenance by the Ngangkari. But that piece there, if you want to read more, is by Rini Kulica, the lead artist, who talks about this experiential learning process as a full body experience. So I will skip over these because we don't have much time, but just to say we have developed a number of VR tools for doing this embodied research. This is a piece that we're currently using in a project with Ukrainian refugees at QPAST, the Refugee Support Program in Brisbane, and it is essentially a kind of body mapping process. But usually we end up developing or facilitating the production of artworks with community that then may have use as what you call tools in the clinical sense. So an example is Edge of the Present, which was made with survivors of suicide attempts, young men who'd made many suicide attempts. And so what we did here, what we do in all of our projects, is really to ask people what they're feeling and what they want to change, essentially. So that, instead of working with sort of top-down classifications of disease and disorder. So it's really about developing the lived experience language, which often hasn't had a chance to be elaborated. But in this case, they spoke a lot about, flat affect, inability to imagine a future and to feel anything about that future. So it was kind of a playful process of thinking about how you intensify feeling. And what happens in this piece is quite simple but effective. Every time you open the door, and you can do so repeatedly, there are these massive, awesome transformations in the landscape. And of course, that does immediately improve mood, and we've done some trials on this. This is now in Headspace youth mental health centres across Queensland. And it's led on, as most of these things do, they kind of snowball. And so we're doing a really nice project at the moment with Headspace in Maroochydore with trans and LGBTQ young people on imagining hospitable spaces and, importantly, what you do when you get there. How do you kind of stay in them and make them work for you? So that's coming soon. And another one, this is a project that we did with DV survivors in Victoria. Space for Action, the title, comes from a concept in DV that describes how space literally constricts for people in this situation. And so the women wanted to evoke the embodied feeling of that, what it is to be in the middle of this kind of maelstrom. But more importantly, as with a lot of trauma work, this was really about working with their testimony and it becoming what we would describe as a verbatim script. So in the sense of that verbatim theatre has worked up that notion. We do quite a lot of fashioning of a script in a way that doesn't embellish but sort of reduces, kind of an extractive process, so you get down to the core sort of affective resonance, and that is quite an exciting process for the participants generally. And I'll just show you a few more instances where we've done that. This project was one with women with vascular dementia who wanted to evoke their perceptual world, really to disrupt some of the more kind of ignorant assumptions about people with dementia. So they wanted to show what it was like to inhabit a world where you might be hallucinating. It's now an AI companion, but that's a whole other story. But through this process, we not only learned a lot about scripting, but about how that process of working on a script with participants can be useful as a research process. And then we developed that Tea and Technology Cafe as the event that we do for people with dementia. And I also wanted to do this one because Tamara was involved in it. When we did our Big Anxiety Festival in Melbourne, we worked with women and non-binary people with a diagnosis of borderline personality disorder, which many of you may know is a very controversial gendered diagnosis that kind of generates its own stigma, and it's very hard to actually develop and find lived experience accounts of this. So I still love this project because we constructed it in this way as a sort of listening event where you join this kind of encounter group and listen to these, it's quite a long piece, listen to these accounts, and those are the participants. We ended up having actors reading the script, which is a process in itself that we can talk about. When do you use voice and when do you use actors? I think no time to talk about this piece, but this was a lovely piece that we did and won some awards for because it had a lot of community impact. It was with survivors of storms in the Yarra Ranges and some young people with quite significant PTSD. But I just want to talk a bit about this concept of transforming trauma, which is a project, as Peter mentioned, it's funded by the Medical Research Future Fund to develop Indigenous-led VR projects across Australia. And but the concept arose from work we did in Warwick in Queensland. We did a mini festival there and have done a number of events there because we built a good relationship with the community. But it wasn't as if we went in with a programmatic intention to transform people's trauma, but when we did the sort of evaluation of this project, people started to talk about change and growth in quite profound ways. So it was a mini festival with Edge of the Present, with different kinds of experiential activities and media. But what happened, and this was another big learning just before we went there, so this was a community where there were really significant rates of youth suicide and just horrendous losses repeatedly across generations. And just before we went there, a young 16-year-old Aboriginal man had been lost to suicide. And there was a big sort of uproar about this. People were very angry because he'd been turned away from the hospital. He hadn't been able to get any help or support. And we were about to go in with this festival, and a number of our institutional supporters said, no, you've got to postpone now because it's too soon and too risky. So we thought about that, and of course what we did was went to the community and said, what do you think? We'll follow your lead. Is it too soon? And they said, no, it's actually too late. You need to show up and someone needs to do something. So not that, of course, we had no solutions, but we did decide to, well, we worked with the community and decided to use that long table format as a way into the event. So it was the night before we were about to do the festival. We had a long table on suicide and invited the community. And it was really a big learning for us on this kind of low-key community-led facilitation and what you need to put around that. And I include that quote there from one of the participants. So it was all sorts of people came, but especially a number of old women elders. And it did seem that this built the kind of trust and accounted for some of those impacts, which of course taught us quite a lot. And so I just want to say that from this project, so I suppose that probably most of the attendees in that program ended up being older Indigenous women, not exclusively, and it was kind of an open invitation. But Nathan Charles, who you see there around the campfire, is a younger man, came with his mother to some of our events and came back to multiple events. And we got talking about what we could do for young men at risk of re-entering the justice system, which had been his story. And we've just been able to do this project. I'm showing you some stills from a VR project that isn't even finished yet. That's been facilitated and led by Ash Dargan, a Larrakia man, musician and does a lot of work in youth justice, and a local elder, Uncle Alan Martin. And they have worked on this piece that is, within a social and emotional wellbeing framework about connecting to country, connecting to community, and so on. But you can imagine that this, of course, is not a substitute for actually being on country, but for young men caught up in the justice system, this can be a really important experiential aid to sort of getting them there. So we're kind of working on introducing it into those contexts. And it really goes back to the work we did with the Nunkery, who said to us, our young men, like young men anywhere, aren't going to sit around and talk about their feelings. But if you can drop them into this fantastic, awe-inspiring experience, you can really begin to kind of work with some of the deeper entrenched feelings. So I'll just end there and show you this this piece that we launched this year at the Tavistock Clinic in London and at South by Southwest. It's called The World Comes Alive, and that quote, "The world comes alive if we invest it with something of our inner selves," comes from the psychoanalyst and artist Marion Milner. And we did a lot of work with this because, of course, it's true, but how do you invest the world with something of your inner self, when the world may be dead to you or unyielding? And so this is really drawing together all of the learnings around what we can do with VR if we attend to experience, and these kind of micro moments of sort of resistance and everything that happens when we feel that we don't kind of belong in place, or we can't connect. So this is the project that we're going forward with on a number of fronts, but this is really the kind of core of the methodology, I suppose, working from that psychosocial experience. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Helena Grehan. I'm from Edith Cowan University in Western Australia, and I would like to acknowledge that my paper was written on the lands of the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present and future, and note that sovereignty was never ceded. In this presentation, I argue for the power of what I call slow listening, as an ethical methodology for spectatorship that can be activated in response to a creative work or a cultural artifact. Slow listening requires the spectator to pause and pay attention, or to tune into the mode of address, the scene, gesture, and the tone, or the language use, or perhaps even the broader political or social context within which the speaking or performing occurs. It is a practice in which the spectator is bodily attuned to the performers and the work in a way that makes room for a range of responses. The possibility of deep understanding and agreement, for partial acceptance, as well as for dissonance or disagreement. As such, it is neither a panacea for the dark times we inhabit, nor is it a fashionable mode of engagement, given the demands on our attention and the seductive power of skimming or shallow reading. Instead, slow listening is a practice through which spectators sit with the often confronting and uncomfortable ideas that contemporary, politically informed performances negotiate, so that they might consider both their responses to and responsibilities for the world rendered in and through a work. As a practice of attuning to something, it requires attention, and yet for those who take the time, it can be rewarding, as it has the potential to open up new ways of thinking about and understanding complex and often difficult scenarios. As an ethical practice, it requires spectators to move beyond reaction, blame shifting, or other processes of obfuscation, and instead to sit with difficult and often conflicting thoughts and feelings. The kinds of work I think can be productively analysed via slow listening are those that contain gaps and silences and encourage or provoke spectators to see, hear and feel what might be beyond the written text. This is work that uses imaginative dramaturgy so that there is no one journey for the spectator to take, no single desired outcome for a performance. Rather, there is the opportunity for spectators to immerse themselves in the work and in what it is saying about the world, about art, and about our modes of response. While these performances do not tell one story, neither do they shy away from the key political, social, and cultural issues of our times. In fact, they create a sophisticated performative language of image, word, sound, and gesture that draws spectators into the aesthetic, while at the same time reminding them about the need to think about and listen to the world beyond the frame. I argue that this kind of work has the capacity to engender a sense of productive unsettlement, where the spectator leaves the theatre feeling stimulated and energized by the sophisticated and multifaceted modes of telling they have experienced, but also feeling a sense of responsibility for the stories told, and perhaps an uncertainty about what to do. It is work that digs in and uncovers stories and themes that we often shy away from or feel too overwhelmed to deeply engage with. By analysing Cut the Sky, and you'll remember that it was referenced this morning by Rachel Swain and Dahlia Pigram, a riveting pre-apocalyptic odyssey of dance, theatre, song, and storytelling that questions the inevitability of climate collapse by Australian Indigenous intercultural performance company Marrageku, I aim to show how slow listening can open up spectators to new ways of thinking and feeling about the dark times we currently inhabit. Specifically, slow listening has the potential to remind us of the embodied, felt, or real-life impacts of climate change and extreme weather events on humans, on more than human entities, on land, and on the planet. While this is something we know in the abstract, it is also something that many of us have moved away from considering deeply, given the myriad crises that besiege us. A slow listening approach can, I argue, return much needed complexity to the debates and discussions negotiated in this work about what our ethical responsibilities might be as we prepare for difficult and unstable climate futures. Cut the Sky by Dahlia Pigram and Rachel Swain with Patrick Dodson began with a research laboratory titled Listening to Country, facilitated by Swain and Pigram in 2013. At the time, there were explorations going on for a proposed huge offshore gas hub close to Broome, Marrageku's home. This caused significant tension among the local communities, with the desire to protect country pitted against the need for employment in the context of lobbying and pressure exerted at all levels by a multinational corporation. As Swain and Pigram point out in the programme for the 2025 remixed version of the work, taking the local lens to amplify and connect issues of international significance, the high-stakes debates challenged us to capture the conceptual collisions summoned by the gas itself, simultaneously as mineral, resource, ancestor, and story of the land. Cut the Sky premiered at the Perth Festival in 2015 and subsequently toured the Kimberley and major festivals in Australia, the Pacific, Europe, and North America. Its run was curtailed due to the cancellation of its tour to Latin America in 2020 because of the pandemic. Throughout this time, the themes have remained the same: a concern with the preservation of country, of listening to ancestors and to the land, the threat from Western large-scale industrialization, whether it is gas extraction, fracking, or other resource activities, acknowledging the importance of story, of deep time, and the increasing precarity of all life on an unstable planet. In the period since 2013 and its inception, the scale and devastation wreaked by climate change has increased dramatically, and a work that was, as the programme note suggests, prescient at the outset, resonates even more powerfully in the present. Cut the Sky was performed as part of the Uramboy Festival in Melbourne on the 9th and 10th of May 2025. The programme note framed it as 5 songs for the future. These are presented as 5 scenes titled Disaster, History Repeats, Deeply Cut Wounds, The Sun, and Dreaming the Future. It is set in a post-fracked Kimberley. The scenes include original songs, dance projections, vocals, poetry, and spoken word. The visual effects are stunning, with scrim projections of the Great Sandy Desert via drone footage, painterly images of a burning landscape rendered through lighting and projection, dark and smoky scenes, a searing giant sun, and at times a merging of human and animal in the bodies of the performers. The dance work is powerful and relentless, with the performers shifting between poetic movement sequences, frantic running and jostling, including repeated circling of a replica fracking wellhead that, apart from some other old protest signs, corrugated iron sheets, and tattered tents, is the main prop on the stage. The experience of watching the performance positioned me, at least, in a state of tense and acute engagement. There is no literal story through which spectators might experience a coherent or convenient beginning, middle, and end, nor would we expect this. Instead, there is a feeling of immersion in the scenes, perhaps projecting what might be ahead, what we may lose, and what we might need to do to survive. There are scenes that present images of what the future might look like, alongside a lament for the failure to listen to the past, to pay attention to Aboriginal knowledge holders and their prophetic stories about caring for and learning to read the land, about the destruction of country and the importance of kin and responsibility. The future in this work is bleak. Climate refugees, at times atomized and at others dancing together, dressed in remnant sheets of plastic, inhabit tattered tents on the fringes of something. What that something is, we are left to wonder. A desert camp, the outskirts of a former town or city, a post-apocalyptic space on the cusp between their bleak present and perhaps nothing, emptiness. They only seem to acknowledge one another at times, each scrabbling for survival. Yet in this context, they dance what seems to be not only their despair, but also their resilience and their courage. They participate in protests. They make a front line of resistance and are repeatedly dragged back from this. Yet they continue to surge forward, standing and sitting together in solidarity, dancing with loud hailers and demanding that they be listened to, that their voices are heard. These are scenes of a future that is layered with the enigmatic presence of Edwin Lee Milligan, a Yakanara poet and performer. His presence in the work is understated, yet profoundly moving. Mulligan tells stories about the formation of the universe, the birth of the crocodile, the spirit of the skies, and changing seasons. He speaks quietly with reverence, and each of his poetic stories includes a philosophical reflection about the present and our place within it, about walking our path, having meaning and purpose, and being mindful of the dangers of growth and consumption. His vignettes both frame and pierce the often frenetic energy on stage, and encourage the spectators to slow down, to listen closely to Mulligan's softly spoken delivery, and to reflect on the land in a more metaphysical way, encouraging a stepping outside of the immediate concerns with the literal changes of land and its inhabitants. I believe that the power of Cut the Sky lies in its layered dramaturgy. This is a dramaturgy that jumps, skips, and jolts the spectators along from meditative moments to confronting smoke-filled scenes in which dancers appear to struggle with the conditions. The impressive physical performances of each of the dancers is mesmeric. They include solos by each performer as well as ensemble dance sequences. Given the context within which the work was initially developed, it is not surprising that the protest scenes are poignant. One of these includes the projection on the screen of a video of ABC News footage of the police attempting to protect oil trucks entering Nukumba in 1980, when there was a protest against drilling on sacred sites in that location. As Swain notes, in a landmark case, the Yungora community, including Edwin's father and grandfather, faced off against American company Amex, which sent 49 trucks into the community to commence drilling for oil. The community eventually won the battle to block their endeavours. The dancers sit quietly in a semicircle in front of the scrim, heads down, as the footage, accompanied by a voiceover of the then Western Australian State Liberal Minister for Education, Cultural Affairs and Recreation, Bill Graydon, speaking to the Aboriginal communities in the area about their protests, is played. While the actual voice of Bill Graydon is not used, the voiceover is performed by Peter Ducker, the language and tone seems shocking to spectators in 2025 because it is simplistic and paternalistic. He says slowly and deliberately, "I want to talk about Nukumba. It was wrong to stop the drilling. It was bad for the people of Nukumba. We need to find oil. Oil is a mineral." He goes on to explain how exploration rights work and the need to obey the law in this regard. He continues, "We helped you get Nukumba because we want you to live there. We want you to be happy at Nukumba, and that is why we want you to obey the law like everyone else. We are your friends." In response to this, dancer Taj Pigram begins to laugh in a menacing way. He laughs as he walks to the front of the stage and then charges to the back. He returns to sit in front of one of the tents where he faces the audience and lets out a sudden scream. People jitter, possibly unsure of how to react to the whole scene, and in my case at least, feeling a sense of outrage at the tone and language used by Graydon. This scene becomes the catalyst for an ensemble piece with the sounds of protest and chanting in the background as Pigram, dancing with an imaginary microphone, rallying the ensemble. Gradually they sit down, as mentioned earlier, in rows of 3 to perform a sit-in. They are dragged away, but defiantly return again and again. This combination of media footage, the silence of the performers, and the language and tone of the voiceover to the defiant response from Pigram, leading to the ensemble protest, all happen quickly. This is one example of the shifts in rhythm, theme, and movement that occur throughout the performance. These shifts create a sense of deep unsettlement in spectators. They may wonder how to feel, what to think, what has already been lost. Yet by refusing to foreclose meaning and interpretation and instead sitting with this sense of unsettlement, they have the chance to engage deeply and profoundly with the questions Cut the Sky raises. As a result, they can return complexity to discussions and considerations about our climate futures, a complexity that is sorely needed. There is no didacticism, no singular approach to storytelling, scoring, or representing in this work. Rather, the performance engages spectators in a roller coaster of images, provocations, thoughts, moods, and ideas about consumption and its implications, about oppression and atomization or disconnection from what is real and important. And in doing so, it is a clarion call for us to step back, step outside, and really consider what kind of people we want to be and in what kind of world. Thank you.
I'm about to present you a kind of a case study, I guess, of work in the development of an online term bank. It's designed, as you can see, to provide access to an online information system in family law for Indigenous Australians. And it's, I hope, a kind of demonstration of what you could call creative practice within the humanities in what is also known as the art and craft of lexicography, that is, dictionary making. The project that I'm introducing you to now was funded for something like 11 years by the Federal Attorney General's Department, which enabled us to do some quite extensive development of our law term finder, that's the term bank, on a Macquarie University platform. It was designed to make specialised information to Australians at large, specialised legal information in plain English. And we supplemented the plain English with translations in the major community languages, starting with, yes, I have mentioned them there, with the largest ones at the time. This was around 2010. The largest immigrant groups had introduced modern and, of course, traditional Chinese was there before, Arabic was there, and then we proceeded to some of the smaller ones, such as Korean and Vietnamese and Spanish. So all these languages were there as translated by professional translators. This is long before Google Translate. And so we had to employ a series of translators to render the key elements of the pages in those community languages. The next slide takes you to the homepage of Law Term Finder. And you can see on the left that list of translations. In the centre, you can see our efforts to explain essentials as to how this plain law could be explained, and a couple of examples to show the issues that might take people to it. What I think is worth reflecting on is how wordy it all is, how much the reader's ability is taken for granted as able to read this kind of language, not the most complicated legal language by far. Not only do they need the capacity to read in general, but also to know what terms they want to look up. And that, if you're new to the whole scene, is not to be taken for granted. So those two things were important factors to empower our work to redesign this term bank. What we needed to do was to recognise that Indigenous people lack perhaps legal literacy. That was certainly found by the Family Court report back in 2010, and that they need help because its general language is probably not accessible to them as people with low levels of general literacy. They have little education to adult reading. And those things, apart from the general problems, the issues they are caught up in of dysfunctional families and violence, not to mention the lack of funds to go and seek legal advice. So we saw ourselves as providing an open kind of access resource which could be then used for preliminary information, perhaps in conjunction with a social worker, but not needing to go to a legal office necessarily. Not that legal aid offices are so easily accessed anywhere but in the city. So it was needed online so it could be taken deep into the country. The biggest challenges I've listed there were that this dictionary-like tool is an obstacle by virtue of its very structure. It relies on the user's knowledge of the written word as they enter it, and then to explore and gather additional information. Knowing the written word is essential for looking up and for finding the words in the typical alphabetic structure. That isn't a print dictionary, and we were there, of course. But the same challenge is in access is there with online dictionaries. For Indigenous people and others, with limited reading skills. You have to be able to spell the words put them into the search system. The same challenge in accessing online dictionaries is there, whether in print or online. And the essential problem in dictionary design is that they depend on the word sign as the entry point, what we technically call semasiological. If you compare then the thesaurus, the access then is via a concept or kind of broad-scale collective meaning through the signification of clusters of words. And that, of course, is the way the thesaurus works and is for the companion term to semasiological, onomasiological. So we need to achieve something more onomasiological, if you like, but it took re-engineering of the whole system to set that up. And so just a glimpse of the homepage with our endeavours to provide an Indigenous access point, and you can see a tile that we had commissioned by an Aboriginal artist on the south coast of New South Wales. And those 2 points take the Indigenous user, or anybody who's interested, pardon me, going too fast, inside. Once you're inside, you're taken to a homepage which gives you a cluster of terms meant to represent 8 areas, main areas of the term bank. And this is, let me get the pointer here, the home page, a small set of terms that represent the core areas. Through them, the users can find their way to more particular terms. Each term card of each of those 8 term cards is accompanied by a graphic. And this is to take you to this easy read system, so-called, that was employed by the government during COVID for health information. And they realised they were often dealing with people with limited reading skills. So you need a graphic, if possible, as a cue to the word or the structure you're presenting. So easy read is part of the design. The core set of terms is there, focusing on family issues, and the key ones we learned in discussion were that family violence and child protection were key areas that needed to be covered. Safety is a central concern in this whole area. We use images to indicate Indigenous identity, foreground the positioning there for them, and also the images that capture as far as possible the meanings of these somewhat complex things. Our images were gratefully received by agreement from the West Australian Blurred Borders Project, and I don't know whether any of you know about that excellent program run by WA Legal Aid. But they created a great inventory of images, and they came very helpfully to us in trying to create the easy read version. Let's now go to that home page. Once you click inside the home page, you see the 8 core cards that show the structure of this re-engineered database, focusing on a group around court, a group around court people, family, safety, and you can see the others. You'd notice also that Blurred Borders, this wonderful project, we credit because they gave so much to us. But what we would like you further to see is that one of our important innovations was to add audios, and they certainly aren't usually they're attached to the material online. You'll note here that we click this again to activate them.
Court people.
Family. Safety.
Family violence.
Support people.
Orders and rules.
Next steps.
And so each card speaks its name as you run the cursor over it, and that hopefully with the picture and the normal spelling adds up to some conversion of information that they can then use. That's the cursor is automatic. We then have a different system. If you click on a card, it takes you to the sub-cards in each set. And so there were 2 motions to be engineered into this. And but also to point out perhaps to you that you noticed that there was a male and a female voice. And we thought long and hard about how to do this. Should they be equally represented? And in the end, tried to alternate them up to a point, except that there were moments at which you felt the term card like family violence needed to be spoken by a woman. Anyway, automatic voiceovers. Moving on to what happens within the sub-cards, support people you've noticed as one of the high-level cards, and then here are just half a dozen, 16 to be precise, of the cards within that. The various organisations that and people who assist Indigenous people. And again, we've got voiceovers. Oh, we've missed that one, I'm afraid. Anyway, here comes the detail at the deeper level. You've got health workers clustered onto a single card, but it's separating them out and providing a verbal description of what they do. No, not getting the, anyway. Perhaps it's just to point out by reading that the description is not, if you like, exactly like a normal dictionary definition.
Doctor, nurse, health worker. These people have training to help you when you are hurt or feel sick, or if you are pregnant or need medicine. The law says that mums, dads, and carers must look after their kids. If your kids are sick, need medicine, or are injured, it is good to take them to see a doctor to get healthy again. Health workers, like doctors and nurses, work at hospitals and clinics.
Okay, you can see that the description of the term is very people-oriented. The people, you as a person, how it affects you and your family, who you go to for help. So there's a lot of emphasis as we work through this on the people that Indigenous people encounter in the family law system, who are not, it's not obvious to them what their roles are, and yet they need to know them because they're help people. Just by way of kind of postscript to what I'm saying, still, if we have to define a difficult legal concept, this one is central to it. We know it's very central to women's access to family law. Trying to get a notion of bail here, and again, you'll see it's often, there is the people key here, that it's delivered by a judge or a police officer, but it comes back to the person, that they sign the bail undertaking on a given day, but they're promising to return to the court at a nominated time thereafter. So there's rather complex arrangements involved in bail and this legal concept that is a central one to lots of their cases. So that just gives you an overview, a very quick one, of the kinds of things that are foregrounded in this. The re-engineering of the system that we had to engage in, and a small third point there, that we are exploiting the on-learn medium, especially the audio aspects of it, to try and make it more accessible, more informative, and I guess more engaging. So I'll leave you with that, and thank you for listening.
So while you're framing your questions for question time, I'll just go back to the three intentions or potential ethical principles that we were dealing with across the panel, and that idea of listening that could be elaborated as slow listening, and secondly, working processes that translate into shared or shareable languages, and these can be visual and digital. And lastly, that social inclusiveness is embodied and spatial. So those three concepts link all our presentations on this panel. Now, have we got some questions here? Can I see some happening? Yes. Just here, yep.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everybody. I'm Erin Brannigan. I just had a question related to Felicity's keynote this morning around care for artists in these contexts, and I was particularly thinking about Tamara and Jill, and when you have artists working on these sorts of projects that are facilitating community sessions and support for others, how do you engage the artists and how do you look after them in the way that Felicity was learning through her project to do this?
I can say a few words and then lend to Jill. Thank you. That is a wonderful question. I mean, I don't think I need to say that vicarious trauma is a real trauma, and that people who work in this space absorb a lot of emotionality, hear a lot of stories, go home with a lot of challenging content and need support. So what we did in the morning after, advised by our advisory board made of experts who are all working in the field, providing different types of services for people who are dealing with different types of loss, was an ongoing support in terms of like our team of 3 or 4 of us was there for all of the sessions. We would be there to greet facilitators and the participants, and we would stay after with the facilitators and the participants. For some of the sessions, we had social workers or psychotherapists present in the group to provide support to those whom I needed. I have to say that I think we were quite lucky in the morning after project that people, our facilitators and artists, were really passionate about talking more about death and loss and what happens after, and have had long careers in this space and have had pre-established forms of support that they could draw on. So we did not have to have elaborate distress protocol, but on some other projects where, for example, the BPD one that Jill mentioned, we did have to have clinicians on board and distress protocols for everyone involved, because some of these things would be really challenging.
Yeah, the other thing I'd say is we have, well, the way things have evolved in our projects, we've understood that eradicating any kind of hierarchy between clinician and participant and also artist, facilitator, is quite important and productive. And so in a sense, everybody is responsible for supporting everyone else. And I think I learned this, that the project that I showed last, where we did the series of workshops in Warwick, I remember there we did the thing that Tamara says of, we always identify someone in the room, be a member of our team, who's a trained counsellor or psychologist, and we always kind of point them out as you do. And I remember someone who, routinely suffered a lot of distress and would have been labelled a kind of vulnerable person, coming up to me at one point saying, as soon as you said that, I made a point of avoiding her because I don't want anything to do with, it was a joke. But there was a truth to it, because this was actually a community where there was an erosion of trust in professionalism. And so when we debriefed about that, we realised that it was very important. And people have said that in the kind of feedback stuff, that they like that kind of levelling, that it's not always clear who the facilitators are, and that everyone participates. And that's why we're quite serious about this method of working from experience. Judy Atkinson, who's many of you will know, a leading expert and practitioner on Indigenous trauma support, says you have to burn your own wood, and you kind of do in these projects, which does, as you're saying, open us all up to different forms of trauma and distress, but equally, it fosters a certain kind of mutual support. So I think that's as important as, of course, the clinical knowledge that we all rely on at certain points.
Over here, Leslie's got her hand up. Yeah.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Leslie Head. I've got a question for Helena. I was interested in your drawing parallels between slow listening and extractive skim reading that we often do as academics. One of the reasons we do it as academics, I think, is to try and work out what's worth investing deeper reading in. So is there a parallel in the listening context? How do you decide what's worth investing time in that slow mode?
Yeah, it's a good question, thank you. I didn't just mean as academics, I meant the pulls on our attention daily by everything that we are pulled by. So I guess I see going into the performance space as a kind of luxury. It's almost like flying without Wi-Fi. You can't do a million emails or phone calls. You've got to just sit there and either be bored or engage. So I think that's kind of a luxurious space we have. We also have it in film and in other contexts. And whether or not one decides to enact a slow listening practice or in that position, I think really depends on how you're feeling, whether the work engages you, whether you're really invested in it or irritated by it perhaps, or confused. And I think when you get into a state where it captures you in some way, good, bad or indifferent, then I think you take the time to sit down and really slowly and carefully try and unpick what's going on here for you, for the work and between you. And that can take days or months. So that's what I was trying to get at. Thank you.
I should just add, Cut the Sky uses juxtaposition very cleverly. So the very cool rock music segments, then if you contrast that with Edwin Mulligan's beautiful moments, which are completely almost still, even though he's moving. He's one of my favourite performers. They're extraordinary. So you can't help but be engaged because of the way the text sets up those contrasts. Now, if we got some more questions, Julian here.
Thank you. Thank you for four incredibly compelling presentations. They were really just so interesting. My question is for Helena again, but it applies to all of them really, which is where does ethics end and politics begin? And how do you manage the border between the two? And I guess I'm thinking that perhaps, the job of a political kind of show or something, cultural something, is to provoke a change or to draw attention to a change. And maybe, the ethics part is to deal with the consequences, which is, a caricature. But how do you manage the tension between the two?
Thanks for the easy question.
Yeah, I thought you'd appreciate it.
Well, from my perspective, I think the good thing about works like Cut the Sky and other works that I try and analyse through slow listening is that they're never kind of singular or didactic or really politically clean, if you like. There was that scene by Bill Graydon, which was really shocking in 2025. But there were many other different modes and and styles and moments and feelings in the work, as Peter has mentioned. So it is a work that deals with politics, all sorts of different kinds of politics. And I think the ethical side of it is where you as the spectator, or me as the spectator, sit there and try to make sense of what this is telling us about things we already know about, like climate, emergency, etc., racial politics and the racism in this country. And I think the ethics is that time you take to negotiate with yourself about how you feel about the way in which that material was presented and the way in which it's telling you something you knew differently or in a kind of emotional or maybe gut-wrenching way. So the ethics for me comes afterwards as you're trying to make sense of A, how you feel, what your response is, and whether you actually have a responsibility to do something with that, whether it's take action, donate to a cause, participate in something, try and change the views of others, whatever it is. So that would be my short answer.
Joanne and Rachel, I think after Joanne.
Thank you. Pam, my question's for you. Can you speculate how you expect the dictionary to be operating in 5 or 10 years? I mean, have you got a plan for it into the future?
That get through? Yes. Yes, indeed. Actually, as we completed work in 2023, one thing is that the whole family law, well, not the whole apparatus, but the law, the court system all changed, and a new approach. That is one of the things that is sort of ongoing, changes to the law that was so carefully put in place in 1975. So there are things there that are needed. One of the things that I feel needs to be done but couldn't be done under our original grant was to take account of where the family law is juxtaposed with criminal law in the states. And it had to regard its boundaries as civil but you were constantly aware that the violence end of it involves other states and the exchange of information between. So the future that I would like to see is that there is that recognition of the state-based laws that intersect with family law differently in every state, I think. But that's a very large project, and it awaits some changes in law, I believe.
I think it's Rachel next, and I might beg a couple of minutes over 3 if we've got more questions.
I'm Rachel Fincham from University of Melbourne. I guess I was thinking about, across the panel, the extent to which ethical methodologies stretch what we understand as research ethics within the university. And so I guess I was wondering if each of you might speak, because you've raised, it seems to me, questions not only of trauma, but of, violence done to persons by institutions, histories of, being excluded or included or not included, political dimensions. So how do we take what you've each contributed to this panel to rethink what university ethics is trying to do when they ask us to fill in forms or constrain the ways in which we work inside our institutions? Thanks.
I'll just be really quick and say the question of ethics in relation to me even presenting this paper, because it's about an intercultural Indigenous performance company, is one that I have had to think long and hard about. And for many years I haven't written anything about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander work because I was afraid that I would be speaking for or going into the wrong territory. But I decided that was short-sighted because a lot of work was going unwritten about critically. And so I always approach the companies I'm working on and invite them to either co-author the work with me, and I certainly give the paper to them to read and give me their view on whether they think it's a fair and acceptable representation of what they're doing. It doesn't mean it has to be always entirely positive, but at least it means we're engaging in a discussion, and they feel that they have some kind of ownership of the material, which is of course their material anyway. So that's what I do.
Sorry.
You go, Pam, then.
Okay, I was just going to say something about the question of university ethics panels, which are a nightmare when it comes to the politics of lived experience, because there's a default assumption that psychiatry in the field of mental health is the final port of call. And so, for example, we've just had a big battle with, I have a lot of PhDs who come from lived experience activist sort of backgrounds, meaning they have been traumatised within systems, and then to be bounced back to that system as the voice of authority when we create space for a thesis that does this, allows for the production of these alternative knowledges. So I'd say the politics is where the ethics committee falls down, and we really do need to re-educate in relation to lived experience. And I would also say that I think, in general, this is what the arts are doing. And when we work with mental health, everybody's interested in lived experience now. It's becoming enfranchised. But medicine and health don't have the methods for listening or let alone generating languages of lived experience. So that's the work that I think we really have to do.
Tamara, do you want to? Pam, you go.
Yes, maybe just a quickie. Much of the university's sort of methods of dealing, research methods, let's go there, may involve some kind of interview with people. And it does strike me that the framework around the kinds of modes of questioning and the accepted receipt of the answer, the kind of discourse that goes on at the frontiers of linguistic interviews, for instance, is, I think, quite carefully controlled in some disciplines. But I'm getting back to medicine, that in that situation, I think it's under-researched and also in need of particular attention because it relates to patient care.
So I would wish there was a stronger interest in, accessible communication in the medical field.
Did you have...
Just a quick thought that in our project we did not have much problems with the ethics committee, maybe because of the legacy of the research, this type of research that has been done in the institution. But we have had problems with other sectors within the university who were hosting this work, which are like a culture-oriented and public-facing oriented parts of the university, who were absolutely petrified of hosting an exhibition that explores grief, because, I don't know, people could feel sad. They could have a feeling in a public space, and what do we do then? So that was the challenge that we had.
I think that is a fantastic point to leave it, to leave our panel today. But I want you to join me in thank our panellists for their fantastic presentation.